People always say revenge doesn't solve anything, that it's just an empty win, leaving you feeling worse in the end. But honestly, I'm not so sure about that. I cheated on my wife and wrecked her career. Am I proud of it? Maybe more than I should be. There was something about it that gave me back a sense of control, like I'd finally taken back what she stole from me without even knowing it. But before we dive into that, let's rewind. You need to understand how everything started. I'm just an average guy. A baker, to be exact. Nothing fancy, but it's what I love. There's something special about working with dough. The feel of it when it's perfect, the scent of fresh bread coming out of the oven. It's fulfilling in a way that's hard to explain. Owning my own bakery? Now that's a dream I've held on to for years, but never quite had the guts to chase. Too risky. Too much responsibility. It's not just about baking bread. There's the financial pressure, managing staff, paying rent, and the fear of failure that comes with it. That fear always kept me from taking the leap. So I stuck to my routine, working at someone else's bakery, letting my own dreams sit there, unfulfilled. My wife? She was nothing like me. She was all ambition, always reaching for the next big thing. One of those high-up directors in some corporate giant. The type of job where everyone wears expensive suits and works in those sleek, glass-walled offices. She managed teams, led major projects. Half the time, I didn't even understand what she did. But it paid, and it paid well. And yeah, I know what you're thinking. Her making more money than me should have bothered me, right? But honestly, it didn't. At least, not in the beginning. Despite our differences, I loved her. Back then, I didn't mind that she was climbing the corporate ladder while I was covered in flour, making bread at a local bakery. Her job was demanding, sure, but we always made time for each other. It never crossed my mind that her success would drive a wedge between us. If anything, I admired her. She was a powerhouse, and I respected that about her. But over time, things started to shift. It didn't happen all at once, more like a slow leak that eventually burst the dam. She began staying at work later and later. At first, I shrugged it off. Her job was important, and I didn't want to be that guy who whines about his wife working hard. Then came the business trips. There was always another urgent meeting, another last-minute trip she had to make. And when she was home, it didn't feel like she was really there. Physically, yes, she was around, but emotionally, she was checked out, distant. I remember the first time I noticed something was off. We were sitting on the couch, watching some movie, can't even remember what it was. But instead of cuddling up to me like she used to, she was glued to her phone, barely paying attention to the screen. I tried starting a conversation, asking her about her day, but all I got were one-word answers, like I was a nuisance. I felt this knot form in my gut, but I pushed it aside. She was probably just tired, I told myself. Work stress, that's all. But it didn't stop. In fact, it got worse. I'd ask about her day, and she'd snap at me, saying she was too exhausted to talk. Or she'd roll in hours later than expected, reeking of perfume that definitely wasn't hers, with little to no explanation. I wanted to confront her, but I didn't. Why? Because her job was the big deal. She was the one paying most of the bills, the one keeping us afloat financially. How could I accuse her when she was doing the heavy lifting? So, I swallowed my doubts and kept quiet. But deep down I knew. You can only push down that gut feeling for so long before it starts eating you alive. By the time I finally faced the truth, I realized I barely recognized her anymore. Then came that one night or early morning really when everything unraveled. It was around 3 a.m., and I was half asleep when her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Normally, I wouldn't have given it a second thought, but something made me glance over. I reached for her phone, curiosity pulling me in. That's when I saw it, a text. The screen lit up just enough to make out the words. A heart emoji. From some name I didn't recognize, but the preview said enough. Can't wait to see you again. I froze. My first instinct was to tell myself I was still dreaming. This couldn't be happening. But there it was glaring back at me like a punch to the gut. My heart started pounding, so hard I could hear it in my ears. My hands shook as I grabbed her phone, desperate to see the rest of the message, to know exactly what she was hiding. I tried to unlock it, But guess what? The password was changed. Yeah, changed. My stomach turned. This wasn't just a mistake. She was hiding something, and I had just stumbled onto it. I sat there, in the darkness, clutching her phone, my mind spinning. I could hear her soft breathing next to me, completely oblivious to the fact that her whole life was about to come crashing down. That's when it all clicked. The late nights, the endless trips, her constant distance. It all made sense now. And in that moment, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to just let this slide. You know, people like to say that revenge doesn't solve anything. But I was about to find out firsthand just how satisfying it could really be. The next morning, I couldn't shake the image of that heart emoji and the message. It was way too clear to ignore. I barely slept after seeing it, and when my wife finally stirred awake, I was ready. I waited until she was up, brushing her hair in the bathroom mirror, before I brought it up. My heart was racing, but I knew I couldn't let this slide. "Hey, I saw something strange on your phone last night," I said, trying to sound casual, like I wasn't already convinced I knew what was going on. She glanced at me through the mirror, her expression as blank as ever. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her hands not even pausing as she continued brushing her hair. "There was a text, around 3 in the morning, from someone, and they sent you a heart emoji." I watched her face closely, waiting for some sign of guilt, a crack in her calm demeanor. But there was nothing. She blinked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. "A heart emoji?" she repeated, her tone as flat as ever. "Yeah, heart. From one of your colleagues, I think. Can I take a look at your phone?" She didn't respond right away. Instead, she stared at me like I'd just said something absurd. Then, without a word, she unlocked her phone and handed it to me. I hesitated for a split second, half expecting her to pull it away at the last moment, but she didn't. So I opened her messages, scrolling back to the conversation I had seen in the dead of night. There was nothing. The chat was completely empty. I frowned and checked again, my thumb moving faster over the screen. Where was it? I knew what I'd seen. I looked up at her, and she raised an eyebrow, completely composed. "Maybe someone sent it by mistake and deleted it afterward," she said with a shrug. "You know people do that, right? They send something to the wrong person and then delete it. Happens all the time." She smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smirk you give someone when they've said something ridiculous, and you're just humoring them. "It's no big deal." She made me feel like a complete fool, like I was some paranoid idiot making a big deal out of nothing. I opened my mouth to argue, but no words came out. What could I even say? The message was gone, and there was no proof of what I had seen. She took her phone back and slipped it into her bag, her eyes on me like I was wasting her time. "Anything else? Or are we done here? I need to get to work." I shook my head, feeling like I'd just lost a game I didn't even know I was playing. "No, that's it." "Good." She kissed me on the cheek like nothing had happened and walked out the door. I stood there for a minute, trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. Maybe she was telling the truth. Maybe someone did send the message by mistake and deleted it. Maybe I had imagined it, but something about it just didn't sit right. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was playing me somehow. Still, I buried it, convincing myself I was being paranoid. Later that day, I started to feel like I owed her an apology. After all, I had confronted her first thing in the morning, accusing her of something, and she had handled it calmly, even rationally. Maybe I was being too suspicious. So, I texted her and asked if she wanted to go out for dinner, somewhere nice, as a way of saying sorry without actually having to say the words. Her reply came back almost immediately. "I can't. Too much work tonight. Maybe another time." I didn't think much of it at the time. She worked late a lot. It wasn't unusual. I told her we'd plan something for the weekend instead. But by the evening, that nagging feeling was back, gnawing at the back of my mind. So, I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. I wandered around the neighborhood for a while, just trying to sort out my thoughts. My wife hadn't come home yet. She'd told me she was still working, and I believed her. Why wouldn't I? But as I walked past one of the nicer restaurants downtown, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. There she was, my wife, sitting at a table laughing, smiling. And sitting across from her was one of her co-workers, another director from her company. I'd met the guy once or twice. They looked cozy. Way too cozy for a work dinner. I froze on the sidewalk, staring through the restaurant window like some idiot. My heart started pounding again, the same way it had the night before. My mind raced, scrambling to come up with an explanation that made sense. She had said she was working late. Maybe this was part of it? A work meeting? I pulled out my phone and called her. It rang twice before she picked up. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, like I wasn't standing right outside the restaurant where I could see her. "Where are you?" "I'm still at work," she said, without missing a beat, as if she wasn't lying to my face. "Just grabbing dinner with some colleagues, going over a few things." "Why?" I clenched my teeth. "You're sure it's just work?" Her voice sharpened, irritation creeping in. "Why are you always so suspicious lately?" "I told you I'm having dinner with colleagues. You really need to relax. You're starting to sound paranoid." I felt my face flush with embarrassment. Maybe I was being too much. Maybe I was blowing this out of proportion. "Sorry," I muttered. "I didn't mean to." "No, you did. You're getting way too clingy with these suspicions. Look, I got actual work to do, okay? Stop calling me every 5 minutes like some needy teenager." And just like that, she hung up. I stood there for a moment, staring at my phone, feeling like I'd just been slapped in the face. I glanced back through the window at her, sitting there with that colleague of hers, still chatting, still smiling. And for a brief second, I felt guilty. Guilty for doubting her, for even entertaining the thought that she might be cheating. I mean, she had a point, didn't she? Maybe I was just seeing things that weren't there. Business dinners happen all the time. I was probably being paranoid, blowing things out of proportion. I was the one making things worse. I shoved my phone into my pocket and walked home, head hanging low. But oh, how wrong I was. So wrong. A couple of weeks later, she told me about this small corporate party her company was throwing. Nothing huge, just a casual Friday night gathering with her colleagues. Normally, I avoided those kinds of events like the plague. Too many people I couldn't relate to, all pretending to enjoy themselves while talking shop. But after that night at the restaurant and all the doubts I'd been struggling with, the guilt had been eating me alive. Maybe I was the one at fault, letting my paranoia get the best of me. So I agreed to go. I figured showing up might smooth things over, make me feel a little less like the problem. Meanwhile, things at work had been going well. We had a new girl join recently, bright, always cheerful, with a smile that seemed to light up the place. I found myself talking to her a lot. Nothing inappropriate, just easy. The conversations flowed naturally in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. She didn't know I was married, though, and I never mentioned it. I don't wear my ring while working because it gets in the way, and the topic never came up. A part of me kind of liked that, being seen as just me, not the married guy. But she's not the main story here. Not yet, at least. Let's get back to the party. It was a Friday night, and we arrived separately. She left work early to help set everything up while I wrapped up my shift at the bakery and got there a little later. By the time I walked in, the party was in full swing. People mingling, drinks flowing, music buzzing in the background. For the first hour or so, everything seemed fine. We didn't stick together. She was off chatting with her colleagues, and I was hanging by the bar, trying to make small talk with a few people I barely knew. It wasn't exactly fun, but it wasn't unbearable either. I figured if I could make it through the night without any drama, I'd count it as a win. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her. She was standing with that same colleague, the one I'd seen her with at the restaurant. And just like that, alarm bells went off in my head. I watched them for a moment, noticing how close they were standing, how quietly they were talking, like they had something to hide. That familiar knot formed in my stomach again, and I knew I had to get closer. I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet, that would have been too obvious. But I needed to hear what they were talking about. I had to know if my suspicions were real, or if I was just losing my mind. It wasn't hard to get close without being noticed. The room was crowded, and people were constantly moving around. I blended into the sea of bodies, inching my way toward them. keeping my eyes locked on the two of them. When I was close enough, I stopped and listened, and that's when I heard it. The words that changed everything. "You really need to leave him," her colleague said, his voice low, but clear enough for me to hear every word. "It's time. You deserve better than this. Kick him out of the house, make it official, and we can finally be together without hiding." I felt my blood turn to ice. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. My wife didn't respond right away, just nodded like she'd already made up her mind. Then, in a voice colder than his, she said, "I know. It's just the timing. I need to make sure everything is lined up before I make my move." Her move. Like I was just some pawn in her little game, something she could toss aside when it suited her. My heart pounded in my chest, that familiar thumping returning, but this time, there was no guilt. Only rage. Pure, white-hot rage. My suspicions weren't just paranoid fantasies anymore. They were plotting, scheming to get rid of me, so they could be together out in the open, without a shred of shame. And all this time, she'd been treating me like I was the one with the problem, making me feel like a fool while she was stabbing me in the back. But I didn't confront them. Not yet. I just stood there frozen, listening and watching. If they were planning their little scheme behind my back, then I'd do the same. There was no point in blowing up on the spot. No, if they thought they could slip away quietly, I was going to make sure they regretted every second of it. So I backed off, blending into the crowd before slipping out of the party without saying goodbye. I didn't need to. I walked straight out the door, already planning my next move. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd overheard. My wife and her colleague plotting to kick me out of my own home, like I was disposable. The anger simmered under the surface, but I knew I had to play it smart. Blowing up in her face would be pointless. If I wanted real revenge, I had to hit her where it hurt the most, her career. I spent days mulling over different ideas, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going to sit back while she and her slimy colleagues skipped off into the sunset. She wasn't just going to lose me. She was going to lose everything. The way she was planning for me. That's when my plan began to take shape. I knew about a competitor her company had been battling for market share. They'd been trying to outmaneuver her corporation for ages, but never quite managed it. I figured if I could hand over some of her company's sensitive information, it would be enough to destabilize her position and shake things up at work. But how was I going to pull it off? I couldn't get into her phone anymore. She'd been too cautious since she changed the password. But her laptop? That was another story. She worked from home often, but on weekends it just sat there untouched. I'd seen her use it enough times to know it held everything: emails, files, presentations. All the ammunition I needed to bring her down. All I had to do was get my hands on it without her noticing. I waited for the right moment, biding my time, and then one weekend, the perfect opportunity presented itself. It was one of those lazy Saturdays, and she was sprawled on the couch, scrolling through her phone. I casually mentioned that I had to go away for work. Didn't make a big deal out of it, just a simple, "Hey, I've got a work thing. I'll be back tomorrow." She didn't even bat an eye. "Okay, cool," she muttered, barely looking up from her Instagram feed. No questions, no curiosity, just pure indifference. Honestly, that made it easier. She was so wrapped up in herself. She didn't even notice me packing up my stuff. But what she didn't see was me slipping her laptop into my backpack along with my clothes. Like I said, she never touched it on weekends, so I knew she wouldn't miss it for one day. I headed out the door, and the moment I was in my car, I drove straight to a service center. I'm no tech expert, so I needed help with the next part of my plan. At the center, I told the guy behind the counter that I needed a full backup of everything on the laptop. Emails, work files, all of it. He didn't ask any questions. Why would he? As far as he was concerned, it was my laptop, and I was the one paying. An hour later, I had a copy of everything. All her emails, confidential files, sensitive documents. The kind of information that would make her company sweat if it ever got out. Exactly what I needed. I didn't bother combing through the files myself. I didn't care about any personal messages or private details. That wasn't the point. I was after the stuff that could ruin her career, nothing else. Once I had the backup, I drove back home like nothing had happened. I put the laptop right back where it belonged, as if it had never left the living room. She was still lounging around, completely oblivious that her entire professional life was now in my hands. I kissed her on the forehead like it was just another normal day and went about my evening pretending everything was fine. But inside, I was buzzing. I had the upper hand now. While she was busy scheming with that guy to cut me loose, I was already 2 steps ahead. The only question left was how I was going to play my cards. After overhearing that conversation at the party, I couldn't stop running through the possibilities. Ruining her career, that was the end game. But I had to be smart. It had to be a clean hit with no trace leading back to me, and it needed to hit her hard enough to send shockwaves through her life. Eventually, I found my target, a mid-level guy at one of her company's biggest competitors. He wasn't some high-powered exec, but he had enough pull to make things happen. His company had been hungry for an edge, something to give them a leg up, and I had just the thing, insider information right from her laptop. I reached out to him discreetly, not wanting to reveal too much too soon. When we finally connected, I didn't waste time. I offered him confidential data, the kind that could shake up her corporation. But I wasn't giving it away for free. I named my price, and it wasn't small. Let's just say it was enough to set me up for the future once the dust settled. At first, he hesitated, said it was too risky. He couldn't hand over that kind of cash without knowing if the data was legit. I expected that. So, I agreed to let him verify the files first. But there was no way I was risking my identity. I had to keep this deal clean and anonymous. That's why I kept it simple. I didn't need anything flashy, just a basic mask to keep my identity hidden. We agreed to meet in a desolate parking lot, the kind of place you'd see in some cheap crime movie. I arrived with a portable hard drive tucked inside my jacket, and there he was leaning against his car, looking jittery. He plugged the drive into his laptop right there, not wasting any time. I stood back, my heart racing, every second dragging on like an eternity. I watched as his face glowed from the screen's light, his eyes darting across the files. He didn't say much, just kept scrolling through my wife's emails, confidential reports, and all the sensitive data that could bring her and her company down. It must have been at least half an hour before he finally looked up, and when he did, I saw that glint in his eyes. "This is good," he said. "Worth the money." I nodded, but I wasn't finished. "One more condition," I added, keeping my voice steady. He raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard. "And what's that?" "When this all blows up, and trust me, it will, I want the story to be that my wife leaked the data. She's the one who handed it to you. Understand?" He hesitated, probably thinking about the fallout, but after a brief pause, he shrugged. "Fine. Doesn't bother me." To drive the point home, I handed him a matchbook with her name scribbled on it. A little symbolic gesture, but enough to make it clear. When the scandal hit, she'd be the one taking the fall, and no one would ever suspect I was behind it. We exchanged the money, cash, of course. I felt the weight of it in my hand, and I knew this was just the start. As I walked away from that grim parking lot, adrenaline coursed through me. It wasn't just about the money. It was about knowing her world was about to come crashing down, just like she had planned for mine. When I got home, I stashed the cash somewhere she'd never look. She was too absorbed in her phone to notice I'd even been gone. Probably some work drama on her end, but she had no idea how much worse things were about to get for her. The next morning, everything seemed normal on the surface. I went to work as if nothing had happened, but inside, I felt like a different man. I was in control again, and for the first time in a long time, I actually felt good. That day, I spent a lot of time chatting with a new girl at work. She was upbeat, full of energy, and her presence made everything feel lighter. We joked about small, meaningless things, and for a few hours, it felt easy. I wasn't weighed down by all the baggage at home. At the end of the day, she turned to me and asked, "Hey, want to grab a coffee after work?" I hesitated for just a second, but then thought, why not? I needed a break from the chaos brewing back home. So, I said yes. We ended up in this small, cozy cafe not far from work. The kind of place where you can just relax and forget about everything. We sipped coffee, laughed, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. No drama, no betrayal, just two people enjoying each other's company. As we finished up, she asked if I'd walk her home, and I agreed. As we wandered through the cool evening streets, the conversation slowed, becoming more personal. By the time we reached her place, she turned to me. "Do you want to come in?" she asked, her eyes holding a question that I knew all too well. I paused. This was a line I hadn't crossed, not even after everything my wife had done. But standing there in that moment, it felt like something inevitable, something I couldn't avoid anymore. Instead of going inside immediately, I stopped and decided to tell her the truth. "I need to tell you something first," I said quietly. "I'm married." She blinked, clearly surprised, but she didn't say anything. I laid it all out, the whole story about my wife, her affair, the betrayal, and the revenge I put into motion. I didn't hold anything back. Part of me expected her to tell me to leave, but she just nodded, taking it all in. After a long silence, she got up and went to the kitchen. When she returned, she was holding a bottle of whiskey. "Whiskey?" I asked, a little surprised. "I thought you were more of a wine person." She gave me a small, tired smile. After hearing all that, wine's not going to cut it. We drank quietly for a while, and at some point, the space between us disappeared. I don't even remember how it happened, but the next thing I knew, we were in bed together. It wasn't planned, but it felt like it was bound to happen. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. And, to be honest, I didn't feel an ounce of guilt. My wife didn't call, didn't text. She had bigger problems to deal with. Her work was about to implode, and the fallout was only just beginning. She didn't have time to wonder where I was, and that suited me perfectly. When I finally did make it home after staying with my colleague, I knew the moment of reckoning had arrived. Things had been spiraling for a while, but now it was all about to come to a head. I stepped through the door, half expecting her to be packing her things or pretending like nothing was wrong. But no, she was waiting for me. And the second I walked inside, she exploded. "You ruined everything," she screamed, her face contorted with pure rage. "Do you even understand what you've done? My career is over. I'm a laughingstock at work, and it's all because of you." I just stood there, letting her words roll over me. There was no point in arguing, no sense in defending myself. She was spiraling, completely unraveling, and I wasn't about to waste my energy pretending like I cared about her precious corporate ladder anymore. Her voice grew louder, each sentence sharper than the last. "You've always been nothing, just some loser from Nevada who's never accomplished a damn thing. And now you've dragged me down with you. You've destroyed everything I've worked for." That one stung. I won't lie. I've never been the kind of guy to brag about achievements, but hearing her tear me down like that, like I was just some failure, hit me harder than I expected. Maybe because a part of me still cared, even though I knew it was all over. I clenched my fists but kept calm. There was no point in meeting her fury with more anger. Instead, I took a deep breath and finally said the words I'd been holding back for far too long. "I think it's time we get a divorce." She froze, clearly not expecting that. Then she laughed, this cold, bitter laugh that sent a chill down my spine. "A divorce? Oh, that's rich. You think you could just walk away from this after everything you've done?" I nodded. "Yeah, I do. Because I'm done. Done with all of it." For the first time that night, the room fell silent. She just stood there, glaring at me, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. It was like all the air had been sucked out of the space between us. I could see her mind racing, trying to come up with something to say, but we both knew it was over. Without another word, she stormed out of the room, leaving me standing there in the middle of the wreckage that was once our home. I didn't follow. There was no need. The decision had been made. After that night, things moved fast. The divorce process started, and, surprisingly, there wasn't much to argue over. She was too busy trying to salvage whatever was left of her career, and I was too tired to care about anything other than getting out. But while my marriage fell apart, something else was beginning to grow. I kept seeing my colleague, the same woman I'd spent that night with. There was something easy about it, something natural. We didn't rush into anything, but it was clear we had a good thing going. After years of tension and resentment, it was a relief to be in a relationship that didn't feel like work. With the money I'd made from selling the information, I finally did something I'd been too scared to do for years. I bought the bakery where I'd been working. It was mine now. No more punching the clock for someone else. No more fear of failure. I owned it, and damn, it felt good. Life started to turn around. My new relationship was great. We laughed together, enjoyed each other's company, and for the first time in ages, I felt grounded. I had my own business, and I wasn't chained to my past anymore. My wife's cruel words about me being a Nevadan who hadn't achieved anything echoed in my mind from time to time, but they felt hollow now. I'd accomplished more than she ever gave me credit for, and more than I ever thought I would. As for her, I didn't bother keeping tabs on how her downfall played out. I'd heard rumors that things were getting worse at work, but I didn't care enough to dig into the details. She was dealing with the mess she created, and I had my own life to focus on. Update. It's been a year since everything went down, and I figured it was time for an update. A lot has changed, and honestly, I never thought I'd be where I am today. First off, I'm married now. Yeah, I know, crazy, right? After everything that happened, I didn't think I'd ever want to go down that road again, but life has a way of surprising you. I ended up marrying the colleague I told you about, the one who stood by me when everything else was crumbling. She's been my rock, and I couldn't have asked for a better partner. And here's the kicker. She's pregnant. We found out a few months ago, and now we're preparing to welcome a baby into our lives. It still feels surreal, like I'm living in someone else's story, but every day it gets more real. I'm excited and nervous all at once, but mostly, I'm just thankful. As for the bakery, it's doing better than I could have ever imagined. After buying it, I poured everything I had into making it successful, and it's paid off. Business is booming, and I've even had to hire extra help just to keep up with the demand. It's still hard work, but it's the kind of work that feels rewarding, you know? I wake up every morning knowing I'm building something real, something for myself. Looking back, it's hard to believe how much has changed in just 1 year. My life was in pieces not long ago, and now I'm in a much better place. I've let go of the anger, the hurt, and all the baggage that came with my ex. She's out of my life for good, and I've moved on completely. I just want to thank everyone who followed along with my story, who offered advice, support, or even just a kind word. You have no idea how much it helped me, especially during the darkest times. Seeing that people cared, reading your comments, it made a real difference. So, thank you for being there. I appreciate you all more than you know. Here's to new beginnings, better days, and whatever the future holds.